And I also would like to inform you that we won't be holding the panel discussion this afternoon, so we should be able to keep the time, original timetable at best, if not better. So I resume the hearing, and I now welcome Ms Claire Savage, Chair, and other representatives of the Australian Energy Regulator. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and capacity in which you appear today?
Claire Savage, Chair, Australian Energy Regulator.
Justin Oliver, Deputy Chair, Australian Energy Regulator.
Matt Garbutt, Acting CEO of the Australian Energy Regulator.
Jeff Purvis-Smith, General Counsel, Australian Energy Regulator.
Stephanie Jolly, Executive General Manager, Consumers Policy and Markets at the Australian Energy Regulator.
Chris Funston, Executive General Manager, Network Regulation.
Thank you. Ms Savage, would you like to make an opening statement?
I will. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
So thank you for the opportunity to appear before this committee today. We've all introduced ourselves already. At the pre-briefing on the 9th of October, I did take a few minutes, and I'm sorry it was probably a few more than a few then, to outline the AER's 4 major areas of responsibility. So rather than repeating myself today, I thought I would like to build on that by highlighting some of the actions we are taking or the trends we're seeing in each of those areas. So I'll start with compliance and enforcement. As mentioned at the last hearing, one of our key roles is to monitor, investigate and enforce compliance with energy legislation and rules. We don't make the rules, but the rules may require us sometimes to develop guidance material which can be binding to support compliance. Our cost-benefit analysis guidelines and forecast best practice guidelines that guide AEMO's development of the Integrated System Plan are 2 examples of this. Our compliance and enforcement functions are a key regulatory tool to protect energy consumers, build trust with the community and keep the energy system stable and secure through the transition. In recent years, we have expanded our compliance and enforcement activity, while maximum penalties have also increased. In the 14 years up to 2018-19, we issued 118 infringement notices totalling $2.36 million and obtained court-ordered penalties totalling $900,000. In comparison, since 2019-20, we have issued 121 infringement notices totalling $3.95 million and obtained court-imposed penalties totalling $48.5 million. Much of our enforcement work focuses on consumer matters relating to the retail law. These types of matters have attracted the largest penalties from the Federal Court. We have also pursued failures in generator performance standards, such as our investigations into the statewide system blackout in South Australia or the explosion at Callide C. They are in-depth and technical, but essential to building confidence as we continue the transformation of our energy system. We will continue to focus on enforcing compliance with the energy laws and rules in the wholesale networks and retail sectors and take appropriate action when required. We also report on performance of wholesale and retail energy markets along with networks. Performance reporting is a critical function of our agency that feeds into our compliance and enforcement function by providing data and analysis of the markets in their operation. Our monitoring and reporting roles also mean we are well positioned as a source of truth for industry data and a provider of frank and transparent analysis that supports decision-making and policy development. Last week we released our latest quarterly wholesale market report for Q3 2024. This report highlighted that wholesale spot prices decreased in most regions except Queensland and South Australia compared to the previous quarter. However, compared to the same quarter in 2023, spot prices were significantly higher across all regions. This was due to a combination of factors, including weather-driven demand, low wind generation and network outages. While wind generation was 21% higher compared to Q3 2023, output was variable in July and early August, and this resulted in the need for more expensive gas-fired generation, hydro and batteries. While there were 54 high-price events, so that's when spot prices exceed $5,000 per megawatt hour in Q3, half of those are in South Australia, there were also 1,314 negative price events in South Australia in that quarter alone. But interestingly, to me at least, those higher spot prices throughout the quarter didn't flow through to forward prices for 2025. In fact, forward prices fell slightly. And it's largely forward prices we see in retail prices, because these are the contracts that retailers need to buy to manage their future price risk. But these forward contract prices have remained high compared to historic prices since the market events we saw in 2022, although they are much, much lower than what we saw at the absolute peak in 2022. Wholesale spot prices rose to unprecedented levels in mid-2022, with the market suspended entirely, driven by a combination of factors, but most significantly the unavailability of coal plant, both on longer-term outages and shorter-term unplanned outages, very high input prices for both coal and gas, and high electricity demand. This shock to the market in 2022 still lingers in the minds of all participants, and this potential for volatility contributes to future price expectations. Coal-fired power stations have long been a supplier of these future contracts, but the plants are becoming increasingly unreliable, and the owners of many of these plants are now more reluctant to sell the same volume of contracts in case one of their units fails. The buyers of contracts also know that when these units unexpectedly fail, and it's coupled with high demand or a network outage, the market can be exposed to sudden and significant price volatility, as we saw in May this year, when prices were so high for so long that the market was put into administered pricing for only the second time in its history. In the last 3 months, we have had more unplanned coal outages than we have had in any 3-month period since the beginning of 5-minute settlement in October 2021. The exposure of our electricity system to international fossil fuel prices through the linking of our coal and gas markets to exports is a further source of volatility. The Newcastle coal price is still twice what it was in January 2021 and well above the $125 cap that was applied last financial year to successfully stabilise electricity markets. The variability in wind and solar output, like we saw in this last quarter, is also another source of variability. So we closely monitor these markets and report on outcomes in both the spot and contract electricity and gas markets, and we consider the impacts of these markets in our decisions like the default market offer. So I'll just turn quickly to the way we regulate revenues and prices for monopoly energy infrastructure. So our core energy networks role is to set the maximum amount of revenue networks can earn and the price they can charge consumers for regulated services. Collectively, it's about $115 billion worth of assets that we're regulating. Network charges make up about 40% of a retail customer's bill, and we have a very strong focus on making sure only prudent and efficient costs are approved. We also have a range of other network roles, including approving large contingent projects that may be needed to be funded outside of the 5-year revenue determination process, and I know this is a strong focus for this committee. Last year, Transgrid submitted their contingent project application for Stage 2 of the HumeLink project. Under the rules, we had 40 business days to make a contingent project application decision for an integrated system plan project. Now, I know that we are often criticised for being too slow in our approvals, but we take these decisions very seriously. We are effectively making a $4 billion financial investment decision on behalf of customers, and we met that 40 business day deadline. But importantly, the clock doesn't start ticking until we have received all the information that we have requested from the applicant. And it took us months to get the information requests to Transgrid and to get all of that information from them. The net result was that after accounting for this new information, Transgrid reduced their ask by more than $100 million, and we reduced it by a further $200 million because through our scrutiny, we identified a range of inappropriate risk assumptions and overinflated biodiversity costs. While there has been a significant focus on the transmission projects proposed to connect renewable energy generation, we are seeing significant proposed capital expenditure increases in the distribution system, and the distribution system is a much larger share of a customer's bill than transmission. There are some very valid reasons for this proposed increase in CapEx, like improving cyber security or climate resilience, augmenting the system for new sources of demand like data centres, digitalisation upgrades, the integration of rooftop solar and batteries. But there is also latent capacity sitting in our distribution system, with network utilisation sitting at just 43%. And so it is vital that before we build more network infrastructure, we use more network infrastructure. The AER is open to addressing barriers to more efficient utilisation of the network and has demonstrated a willingness to look at ring fencing waivers or regulatory sandboxes if it will result in better outcome for consumers. We need to understand the barriers to more efficient utilisation of network infrastructure. We need to get crystal clear on the role of distribution system operation. We need to establish what level of network visibility or control over distributed resources is needed to moderate increasing capital expenditure. So I'll finish my remarks by just talking about our role in protecting energy consumers who are experiencing vulnerability or financial hardship while enabling consumers to participate in energy markets. Our most visible role in this space is the setting of the default market offer every year for New South Wales, South East Queensland and South Australia. It is designed to protect consumers from unjustifiably high prices for a retailer's most basic standing offer. We released our final decision on the 2024-25 default market offer in May, with residential consumers seeing price reductions between 2 and 6% in New South Wales and South Australia, with moderate increases of 2 to 5% in South East Queensland. We facilitate price comparison for consumers in a competitive retail market through our Energy Made Easy website, energymadeeasy.gov.au. I say it over and over so that people make sure they use it. In 2023-24, there were over 3.5 million visits to Energy Made Easy and more than 1.3 million Australians who completed an energy plan search to compare retailers' offers. We have a particular focus on those consumers experiencing vulnerability. Our latest data shows the proportion of residential electricity customers accessing hardship programs has increased from 1.4 to 1.9% over the past 12 months. This reflects both higher energy prices and broader cost of living pressures, coupled with our compliance and enforcement focus on ensuring retailers give their customers the help they may need. In 2022, we began implementing our Towards Energy Equity strategy to rethink and reshape how the energy market supports consumers experiencing vulnerability and those who will always struggle to participate in the energy market. Our strategy includes the implementation of the Better Bills Guideline, a customer vulnerability toolkit for retailers to improve their identification and support, and a review of payment difficulty protections, the outcomes of which we hope to share with energy ministers in the coming year. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee today. I welcome your questions.
Thank you. Would you like to table that for the committee's benefit? Thank you very much. Deputy Chair, would you like to go first?
Thank you. Just building on what you were saying there about coal, that unavailability and increasing unreliability, I think is what you said. What impact is that having on prices?
So I think what we've seen, particularly since 2022, has been both the impact of fossil fuel prices. So particularly after we saw, the post-COVID recovery in late 2021, and then in early 2022, obviously we had the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. That had significant impact on global coal prices and global gas prices. Both of those have flowed through into our domestic electricity markets because we have obviously coal exports and gas exports, and so there's an opportunity to either burn them in Australia or to ship them overseas, and that's had an impact. And I think the exposure of Australia to those volatile commodity markets has certainly created the potential for future price increases as well. We've still got very high coal and gas prices compared to historically, so that's flowing through current prices at the moment. And then we've got much less reliable coal plants. So as I said in my opening comments, we had a look at the numbers. In the last 3 months, we've seen more coal outages unplanned. And so it's very important to distinguish between planned and unplanned. So planned outages you can literally plan for. So people know they're coming, other generations made available, network outages aren't scheduled, et cetera, so the market can generally accommodate those. Unplanned outages are much more difficult to deal with because they happen immediately and there isn't necessarily the backup resources you'd want, or it might be at the same time as a network outage. So we've seen more coal outages in the last 3 months than we have in any other 3-month period since the introduction of 5-minute pricing, which is in October 2021. And so that's also having an impact on both how willing coal plant owners are to basically sell forward contracts, and also, I guess, people's willingness to take risk, spot market risk in the future. And so what we're seeing is that whilst we can get some very low spot outcomes from time to time, that forward price of electricity has stayed quite stubbornly high, and that's the thing, that 80% of that's what feeds into the default market offer. So that's really what residential customers see, and to a certain extent larger customers, is that forward contract price.
And so you're saying we're seeing higher prices, but we're down from a peak in 2022. What's driving that? Is it just that unreliability? Are there other elements that are driving that higher price?
So we're talking about higher forward prices. Spot prices have been variable, so they've been up and down. So some quarters are up, some quarters are down. It depends on what's happening in the market. Sources of volatility is what tends to keep forward prices high. So the concerns about plant performance, the concerns about future commodity prices, but also the availability of wind and solar can play into that future price volatility, and that they are the things that can keep the forward market higher than what it would otherwise have been, say, 2 or 3 years ago.
So in terms of the unreliability of the sort of coal plant, and were you saying gas plant as well, or is that more stable?
No, that's more stable.
That's more stable. So in terms of the instability, or what's driving that?
Age, probably. I mean, one of the trends we have seen in the data that we've been looking at is a lot less planned outages and a lot more unplanned outages. So, I mean, we would have to ask the coal generators, but I think that what that would probably suggest is a lack of investment in the coal plant now, and maybe a wait
in terms of maintenance.
Yeah, and maybe a
upgrades.
wait till it fails rather than a plan to maintain it. Now, that's not unsurprising, given the fact that they have shorter lifespans from here to the end of life. But certainly that shift from planned outages to unplanned outages can make it much more challenging to manage in the system.
Because I think I've got a quote here from you at Senate Estimates, one of your favourite times of the year, I know.
Love it. 3 times a year.
Yeah.
2 weeks.
And
Yep.
what you said is that
Same VAT channel.
that the ageing coal fleet is why we're seeing gaps in the reliability forecast in the latest electricity statement of opportunities. And from our perspective, in terms of ensuring that we have lower prices and a reliable system, we absolutely must unlock the new investment. Can you just elaborate for us what that new investment looks like, and how that might give us a comparatively lower price or more reliable system into the future?
So those comments would have been in relation to when the Australian Energy Market Operator, who you've had lots of time with today, updated the way they do the electricity statement of opportunities. So they will have in their modelling essentially put through what's called an increased forced outage rate, and that's really that modelling of what I was just talking about. So making sure they're modelling the right level of potential coal outages in the system. And when they made those changes to update the coal forced outage rate, that's what drove those gaps in the reliability forecast. Now, if we're not going to see those gaps emerge, we do need to see a lot more new investment, and an investment in line with what we're seeing in the integrated system plan. So we need to see a lot more investment in both renewables, so large-scale wind and solar, but also rooftop solar, storage capacity, both large and small-scale, gas-fired generation, and also large sort of pumped hydro and transmission. So we're going to need a bit of everything, I think, to really get there. But, yeah, we do need to see that investment happening.
So can you talk to us a little bit about the transmission and the investment in transmission? There's a debate on foot about whether adjustments to the transition or beefing up the transmission is worth it, and whether we should or shouldn't actually undertake that work.
Look, I mean, we don't actually forecast this ourselves, obviously, so we're going from what's in the integrated system plan. But when you look at that plan, they are estimating that we'll have, I guess, a doubling of power supply, or the doubling of the size of the system to meet the electrification of the economy, and then potentially 3 to 4 times larger system to meet energy exports, as we replace coal and gas. So when you stand back now and think we've got a few tasks to do, the very first task is to replace the ageing coal fleet. And so that requires a rebuilding of the current system. Then we have to think about a doubling of the current system to accommodate the electrification of the economy. So both from large industrial emissions, but also from transport. And then we think about the expansion of the electricity system to accommodate energy exports of some form if we're going to maintain our standard of living. And so from that perspective, we're going to need a lot of everything. And so that will be new sources of renewables, which will need to be supported by new transmission links. But I would hope it's also about accessing and unlocking a lot of the distributed energy end as well. So a lot more rooftop batteries, solar, community batteries, community storage, and making sure that we get the most out of our existing assets, and that distribution system is a big part of that. So, the integrated system plan assumes a level of orchestrated distributed energy resources. That's an assumption. We think there's a lot of work that has to happen to actually make sure that orchestration happens and that we get the value out of what consumers have already invested in, plus the investments they'll continue to make. So a lot more at that end, but we also need a lot more at the bigger end as well.
So in terms of the opportunities to explore those distributed energy resources, what are those opportunities? How do we explore them? Are they being explored? Will they lower our future sort of distribution network costs?
So governments collectively have done a piece of work called the Consumer Energy Resources Roadmap, and I am chair of the Energy Advisory Panel, and we made a number of recommendations to ministers around some key actions that need to be taken in that space. That will be part of it. I think from our perspective, we're looking at the distribution system and seeing 43% utilisation rate. We're seeing really big upticks in investments in solar and batteries. EVs are obviously coming. Data centres, smaller scale renewables into the distribution system. So making sure that we can have those distributed resources locate in the right places and used at the right times of the day is the best way that we can make sure we can get the most out of our distribution system. So we're interested in working with distribution businesses to make sure they're making only efficient upgrades to the network, that they're making better use of what they've already built, and that they're giving the signals they need to retailers about when energy can be used and consumed, or otherwise that there's some level of algorithms or control that will help customers to manage that energy use. So it's being done in an orchestrated and coordinated way rather than sort of just everybody building out their own little mini power system, which would not be the least cost way of doing that.
So in terms of driving this kind of transition, is it your role? Is it government's role? Is it someone else in the network? Whose door does this sit at to drive the kind of efficient development that you frequently talk about?
So we're obviously not the policymaker, so it sits with policymakers. There are elements, though, that once policy is made, that we'll have to implement. So, when you see changes to the legislation, that's done collectively through energy ministers, the Australian Energy Market Commission, who you'll see after us, they'll do the subordinate legislation, so the regulations that support it. Where we come in is usually in the more detailed implementation, so guidelines, etc., and then in the decisions we make with with distribution businesses. So we look at things, for example, about ring fencing and the ownership of community batteries by distribution businesses. We look at things like where they play, whether they can do EV charging, whether they can have a role behind the meter. All of those things are parts of the decisions we make. So we have definitely a role to play in that, but we don't own the entire space. We're a contributor to it.
And is there a common view about looking forward, what needs to occur?
The CER roadmap has 53 projects in it, so I'm pretty sure there's a comprehensive suite of things there. The question we're still asking ourselves is there more? Now, not more projects, because I think we've got enough policy projects on the run, but, are there things that could be trialled through, for example, our regulatory sandboxing function to make sure that we pull through some of the technologies and the build rather than just relying on the enabling policy frameworks, but are there things that can actually get the doing done?
You've talked about coal and gas and renewables. In terms of, as the regulator, in terms of the ideas on the table for nuclear development, what, in your sense, from a regulatory sense, what would it take from where we stand now to build a regulation system for any nuclear energy?
So obviously we don't have a role specifically in that, but I think from...
I'm kind of asking you to, on the basis of your understanding regulating the other energy systems, and even if it wasn't new, like a new system of that size and obviously import, like what would you anticipate being the process and time frame to build a regulation system, or the challenges?
Yeah, and look, I have made this comment a couple of times. I have been involved in the development of a lot of different policy processes over the years, and usually it involves legislation, rules, guidelines, and I would imagine a nuclear power industry would require environmental, safety, technical, commercial, and then potentially some changes also to the electricity rules depending on its operation. So, you know, I would have thought the removal of, and it's across government, levels of government, which is what we usually do as well. By the time you were to try and go through the removal of the current prohibition and then develop those 4 or 5 different regulatory frameworks, with each probably having their own, you know, issues paper, draft decision, final decision, implementation, I would have thought you'd be looking at 8 to 10 years for the regulatory framework. But I don't have any, you know, expert view on how long it would then take to build a power station. But I would have thought the regulatory framework itself would take 8 to 10 years.
Okay. And do you... Oh, okay, last question. What role do you have in respect to AEMO? Like, how do you two work together? How does that crossover work? You know, is it your job to sort of pull them up on issues? If you just unpack that a little bit for us, that would be great.
Yes, certainly. So I think, I mean, we work with AEMO in a range of different ways. So, you know, in the Energy Advisory Panel, we're colleagues, which is, you know, one setting where we're giving advice collectively to ministers. But we also have a range of ways in which we are expected to, and we do hold AEMO accountable. I might ask my colleague, Deputy Chair Justin Oliver, but he's also the chair of our Compliance and Enforcement Committee, just to give you a bit more colour on that.
So thank you, Senator. In relation to AEMO, particularly in relation to something like the Integrated System Plan, the National Electricity Law and the rules actually create sort of a suite of measures that are all directed towards AEMO accountability. So the first layer of that is transparency. So, for example, after AEMO publishes its inputs, assumptions and scenarios report, and after its draft ISP, we're required to produce what's called a transparency review, where we look through what they've said and we look for areas where perhaps they have not explained themselves as clearly as they could have, or they could give more detail. So, for example, in January this year, we published the transparency review of the draft 2024 ISP, which was released late 2023. And one of the things we pointed to there was we asked them to do a bit more work or explain their modelling around the assumptions they make for state policies around renewable energy zones. For example, they'd referred to Victorian offshore wind targets, but they hadn't really talked about Queensland's infrastructure blueprint or RES roadmap. So we pointed that out in the transparency review. AEMO produced an addendum following that where they went into that in more detail. So there's the transparency piece to shed more light and make sure people understand what they're doing as they do it. There are aspects then in terms of people who are unhappy with decisions that perhaps are made along the way. So again, in the context of the ISP, if people who've made submissions feel there are certain procedural steps not being undertaken, in certain cases there's an avenue where they can bring a dispute to the AER in relation to some of those procedural steps, and we have the ability then to hear that, and if we think that's right, to direct AEMO to complete some of those procedural steps. It's narrow, but it's there. Registered participants do have an ability to bring a dispute under Chapter 8 to a dispute panel in relation to the interpretation or application of the rules. That's not a function that involves us, but it exists. AEMO, of course, is subject to judicial review. Again, that's not a function that involves us, but it does exist. And then we come to our enforcement and compliance tools as well, which are some of those are applicable to AEMO. There's no provision for us to issue infringement notices against AEMO or for the court to impose penalties, so we would never go to court seeking that. But we do have the ability to investigate, to look into possible breaches, to decide whether a law enforcement response would be warranted or appropriate. And if the circumstances were there, we could go to court to seek other orders, for example. But that really is just one of that suite of tools that we have and the suite of measures that exist to hold AMO to account in terms of how they undertake that work.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Chair. Look, I just want to start, Mrs Savage. I saw you've made comments in recent times about a wall of CapEx. You explained to us how big that wall is and what its implications are.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, Senator. I think I have made comments about the wall of CapEx, and what that relates to is the expenditure that we are starting to see in the distribution system. So when I look at the current proposals that are in front of us, so we've just made a draft decision for Ergon and Energex in Queensland, for one in South Australia as well. We've got 5 new proposals coming from Victorian distribution businesses early next year who have draft proposals out at the moment. At least 3 of those businesses have had proposed increases of more than 100% in their CapEx on what we'd approved in the previous 5-year period. Some of the others are 40, 60%, depending on the network. You know, we have got a few that are lower, sort of 18, 20, 25%. But no one at this point in the current sets of business proposals that are in front of us is proposing a reduction in CapEx. And so my concern, and when I've made those comments, Senator, is about if we don't get smarter about the way we use the distribution system, then we won't see lower unit costs in terms of electricity. And so there are really good reasons why network businesses, particularly distribution businesses, might need to spend additional money. So cyber security is obviously a really important one. A number of them are needing to invest for climate resilience. We're seeing increased expenditure around the integration of new sources of demand, so data centres in particular, but also the integration of solar and batteries as well. So there's lots of reasons for it. What we're really focused on, though, is making sure that as the system electrifies and as we get more load growth, that we actually improve that asset utilisation so that the unit cost of electricity goes down rather than up. So that wall of CapEx, I'm using that as a real call to action, I guess, for us, but also for the distribution businesses to say, okay, as we're starting to do these things, we've got to be super smart about where we're locating assets, how those assets are being used throughout the day, and making sure we drive home those potential savings to customers.
How much of a retail electricity bill is are you just talking about distribution?
Yeah, just distribution.
Right.
Yeah.
So how much is the distribution cost in a typical Australian
it
power
depends
bill?
on the region, but it's probably about 30 to 40%, depending on
Right,
the
so
region.
30 to 40%, so a big chunk.
Transmission's another
It sounds like, at least on the current plans, this wall of CapEx is going to prevent any reductions in power prices for Australians, given the size of distribution costs in their bill.
It's not quite that simple in the sense that CapEx is what we'd call slow money. So CapEx is recovered over a very long period of time. And as demand grows, the per unit cost goes down or can go down. So in some of those networks, we're seeing price increases, and in some of them, we're seeing price decreases. It depends fundamentally on that relationship between how much additional cost there is and how much additional demand there is.
But just going to what you've said on this, it says it was a Q&A with AER Chair, sorry. I think it might have been the Australian Financial Review. It's on your website. No, Energy Networks Australia Conference, sorry. And you said, I describe this as a wall of CapEx coming at consumers that could more than offset the lower costs of wholesale energy as we make the switch to renewables, unless we find more ways to be efficient. So, just going back to my question, this is a real risk. If the current plans for capital expenditure potentially will mean no reductions in power prices if they're all approved and go ahead.
So I think the word could is operative there.
And I said potentially.
Yeah.
Yep.
So from my perspective, what we need to do, the reason why that's important, because I think we can lower the unit cost of electricity as demand increases, particularly from data centres, electrification of transport, etc. But what we can't do is just sort of say, well, we don't like time. And so I'll come to the nub of it, if you don't mind, Senator. But, you know, time of use network tariffs are a critical way that networks communicate to retailers about when their assets can be used. Increasingly, there is some opposition to time of use tariffs. if we don't like time of use tariffs and giving people price signals, then we will need to have greater levels of control about when different assets are used through the day. And if we don't do those things in combination, or one or the other, or the two together, we do risk higher bills. But it's very much a could be potential risk at this point rather than an actuality. And what I'm trying to do as the AR chair is make sure that we are doing everything to make sure that doesn't eventuate.
So you mentioned earlier that some of this wall of CapEx is due to solar and battery rollout, electrification. Some of those, at least, are the cause of government policy decisions to subsidise, support certain types of consumer goods and or energy production systems. How much of this wall of CapEx is because of government policy decisions to provide incentives to certain types of things in the energy market?
I don't have the breakdown of that.
So no one's doing that work? It just seems strange to me. It goes back to my conversation earlier that, okay, some of the stuff you're talking about, like data centres, okay, there's a growing demand. It's exogenous, if you like, to this house and this building. But typically, good policy-making processes would seek to isolate the all other things being equal effect of a policy decision. So no one is looking at what the policy costs are of an EV strategy, of a solar strategy, and the consequent impacts on distribution grids?
Well, I'm not familiar with what everybody else is doing. I just know what we're doing. Right. And so from our perspective, one of the things that's really challenging, like if you're thinking about a distribution system and you're thinking about the upgrade of a feeder, or you're thinking about a transformer or a circuit breaker or whatever it might be, how do you isolate how much of that is because of an EV or because of a solar panel or because of a data centre? So certainly there are a range of drivers for why we're seeing the need to invest in these networks at this time. And we have got numbers on how much of it's augmentation CapEx, how much of it's replacement expenditure, and I can give all of that to you.
If you take on notice I suppose augmentation is the one that will be the relevant variable, but as you say, there are lots of different drivers of that. But that's not dissimilar to almost any other policy decision. It's always difficult to isolate potentially the impacts of a policy decision.
Yeah.
Normally, we would try to do that in any kind of cost-benefit study, in a regulatory impact study. Again, it doesn't seem to be happening here in this space.
I think that's probably a question for the department. But
okay.
I think also probably the other comment to make would be there has been a recent rule change which has introduced what's called export tariffs for solar. And so,
I'm going to come to that.
Yeah, okay.
If I could just pause there, because I just wanted to quickly, before I come to that, and I've got limited time, you just mentioned just quickly on some of the issues raised earlier. What percentage of coal used in Australia's coal-fired power stations is exposed to the export price?
Well, it depends in Queensland and New South Wales because you're looking at different power stations.
Can you just give me you raised the point before that you felt that a material issue was the export coal price. How much how much of our coal used in electricity power stations is exposed to that price?
So what's more relevant is actually how much is at the margin. So when you look at, for example, Gladstone or you look at Eraring, those two power stations buy coal that is also used for export. And so when you have power stations that bid at the margin, because we have a marginal electricity price, so it's set based at the margin.
I understand. Okay, well, how much of the margin? What's the percentage?
Well, it doesn't matter how much percentage at the margin. If the marginal
Well, how many times? Like, you can calculate what percentage of the time.
Well, I can tell you what time.
Because you do calculate that, I know.
Okay, so if you just give me a moment to open this, I'll answer your question. So, for the last quarter, black and brown coal will have set the price, being the marginal generator in the market, almost 50% of the time.
And how many of those are exposed to the export market price of that 50%?
So I'd need to go through and look at who was the
I just
individual
worry,
plant.
there's a lot of assertions made in this space, like throwaway lines like the export coal price is to blame for high power prices, but it's really only a handful of power stations that are exposed to the coal price in Australia, so I'd be surprised if it's a very large figure. And if you're going to make assertions like that, it's strange there's not the data to back it up.
But
you mentioned
Senator,
earlier...
Just to clarify that point, if you don't mind.
Yeah, you can respond,
The power station that sets the price is the most expensive power station in the system. And so the power stations that have the most
That's not quite true. Can we just be correct? It's the most expensive power station to meet a certain level of demand.
At that
Right,
point in
yeah,
time,
right,
yes.
right. Not the most expensive.
But that power station is the most expensive coal-fired power station in the system, and the most expensive power station in the system when it's setting price. And those the most expensive coal-fired power
Sure.
stations are the ones
Yeah.
that are exposed to.
This is all. I mean, you're not answering my question though, and you're not.
No,
backing up your
actually
research. No.
am.
You're not, because you've also said in other things I've seen you say, Mr. Savage, that coal is running at very low utilisation rates. So those power stations are not going to be running when the marginal price is set at all. So they're not going to be in the bidding stack. And so again, I'll just come back. It's one thing to make an assertion. It's another thing to have the facts and figures behind it to establish it. And you don't have those before us.
No,
so,
I do.
So it's a very big statement to make. And it gets reported. Everybody thinks, oh, it's all coal's fault. But there's nothing behind it.
No, I think just one other point though.
Yeah.
Domestic coal-fired power stations that are not exposed to the export markets
Sure.
are generally not the ones setting price.
Okay, well, again, I'd love
So
to
I'm
see
happy
the
to take that on
quantitative
notice
data
and
behind
come
this
back
that you
with
don't
the
have.
specifics.
You also mentioned that one of the factors behind the current high power prices we're all suffering under is unreliable coal-fired power stations, and older ones. So if the absence of a reliable power station increases the price, wouldn't building new reliable coal-fired power stations lower the price?
My understanding from the work that the CSIRO and AEMO have done is that the cost of building a new coal-fired power station would be much more expensive.
Well, AEMO today refused to at all stand behind that. They said they haven't evaluated that because they take the net zero targets, the 82% renewables target as a given. So they don't evaluate. Well, that's what they said.
Sorry, my
I'm
understanding of
definitely
their
not.
testimony was that as it related to the Gen Cost report that they
They didn't
did,
even mention Gen Cost, not in
with
response to
the
my questions.
CSIRO.
No, they did not mention
Okay.
the CSIRO and Gen Cost report. I mean, I don't think that report's worth the paper it's written on personally, but they didn't even mention it, as I thought they would. Thought we'd end up in a long argument about the relevance of LCOE and all these things, but they didn't.
Okay, well, I'm just basing it on that.
You're basing on that, and well, I'm sure we'll get to the CSIRO during this inquiry, and don't get me started on their coal price assumptions, which massively are weighted towards the export price for some unknown reason. I want to move on, and I want to come back to this issue of solar. So I think you were going to, starting to on this issue that there seems to be quite a decline in feed-in tariffs at the moment for people who have rooftop solar. What's happening, or why is that happening?
So firstly, just to establish our role, we don't have a role in setting feed-in tariffs. That's
Okay.
something that retailers do. My understanding is that retailers, in deciding how much to offer customers in their feed-in tariff, would be looking at the value of that energy.
Sorry. Yep.
Would be looking at the value of that energy at different times of the day, and that would be what's informing their pricing
Right.
of the feed-in tariff.
Yeah. So, I mean, it seems to me that one of the issues, obviously, is there's a lot of solar at that time of day. That's a fair conclusion for what's happening here. And so the more solar we put into the system, the lower the the lower the feed-in tariff is going to be for households from their solar rooftops.
To the extent that it drives down wholesale prices and retailers choose to reflect that in the prices they offer customers, I think that would be correct.
So the ISP at least has grid-scale solar growing 6 times from 9.5 gigawatts to 58 by 2050. That's potentially going to have a big impact then on the feed-in tariff that households receive for their solar, is it not?
I think when you look at the ISP, it also has quite significant growth in household battery storage systems. And so the way in which customers value solar might change through time when you've got a battery system. So your ability to shift load into the middle of the day, particularly if you have an electric vehicle, is one way of using your solar in a different way.
Does AEMO assume a subsidy for household battery?
I think that's a question you'd have to ask them.
Yeah, they've responded to an FOI I just put on the record. They've said that their battery forecast assumed a 50% capex subsidy from 2024.
Is that what they said?
Yeah, that's what AEMO says in an FOI. I can send you the tweet that Aidan Morrison very usefully got and put up. Apart from just the reduction in feed-in tariff, I've seen reports that there'll effectively be a charge, a sun tax, if you like, in New South Wales going forward, that in the middle of the day, some households are going to be charged 1.2 cents a kilowatt hour to export their electricity to the grid.
So I think
Is that going to be an increasing
misreporting.
phenomenon here? Because
Yeah,
of
so I'm happy to walk you through that. So my understanding of that reporting, and if it's the same as what I believe it to be, is that it relates to what's called an export charge, which is a network charge, not the feed-in tariff. So it's separate, quite separate to the feed-in tariff. And what that relates to is the cost of augmenting the system to upgrade the networks for exports. So to the point that you were making earlier about are we basically, seeing solar customers contributing to the cost of the network? Well, yes, but to the same extent they're also being charged a cost for exporting through that period of the time of day as well, if we have to upgrade the network for that. But they also get a reward if they export later in the day, and that might be making use of, west-facing panels or batteries that are connected to the grid. And so those rewards actually encourage and incentivise that optimal use of solar and batteries through the day.
So, was that something approved? That sun tax, was that approved by the Australian Energy Regulator? Was that something you had to
So the
sign off on?
export charge, I'm not aware of it being called a sun tax, but that export charge...
It's been reported as a sun tax.
That was essentially...
I mean, it's not, I just say that the words are very important and
so
not used very accurately in the space, so I like the word sun tax. I think it describes it really usefully. But yes, okay.
Yeah, so the history to that is actually quite important because there was a rule change that was propagated by consumer groups, so, people like St Vincent de Paul, and I think it was also the Total Environment Centre and a few other different groups at the time who recognised that we needed to get better signals through the system for the use of solar and batteries in the day. And there are different costs for the distribution system depending on when you use it and how you use it. And we all pay a charge when we import energy, so recognising that there's a use of the system when we export energy as well. So that was actually a consumer-driven rule change that was put to the Australian Energy Market Commission. They assessed that rule change. They made the rules.
So they approved it, the AEMC.
They approved it.
And you're saying Australian households support this? You said it came from... When you say consumers, what do you mean by consumers?
So then just the next step of that, though,
because I doubt Australian households will be very happy about this. But
once the rule was approved, the distribution businesses, it's our job to implement it through the distribution decisions. Distribution businesses did quite significant consultation with their actual consumers, not representatives, but their actual consumers. And in New South Wales, that was a part of it, as well as in the ACT. We've seen it in South Australia and Queensland as well. In the design of their tariff structures. So keeping in mind...
that was managed by the AMC. Maybe I'll take it up with them, was it? Who
approved the rule change?
Well, who oversaw that this consultation was Reggie Didge?
Do you mean the original consultation or the one...
No, the one with... Because you're saying consumers love this and they want to support it. I find it hard to believe. But you're saying the energy companies did that.
So the utilities have done
say that consumers love this.
So we had an independent...
Who actually assessed that was a real consultation?
Yeah, so we had two ways. We did it with our staff were present for it, and we also had a consumer challenge panel who also witnessed all of the and provided...
Maybe I know if you take me through the details of what that I mean, I doubt, I hear David saying some things. If I called a town hall and asked people, do you think it's a good idea to be charged 1.2 cents a kilowatt hour for your exports of solar, I doubt I'd get much support. I find that really hard to believe. Now, I'm not saying it's not a good idea. I'm just really, really cynical that consumers somehow think this is a great idea.
Well, there are more consumers than just solar consumers, Senator. And I think when you look at the consultation that was done, and in fairness, there is an independent report into the quality of that consultation, which we're happy to make available.
Okay, please provide on...
but that consultation was done, and when you come up with network charges, there are winners and losers because there is always a set pool of money that needs to be recovered. So making sure we balance those charges fairly across the system is a big part of it.
I mean, the ultimate problem here, though, isn't it, is that we're going to create a two-tier system where people who can afford batteries will do really well out of their solar systems, and poorer households who can't afford. It's a very big cost, can't afford a battery, even with a 50% subsidy, it's a very big cost. Can't afford a battery, will have to pay, they'll be charged, they'll be taxed.
So you're right, it's an absolutely critical focus for us, and so we've looked at that as part of the Towards Energy Equity strategy and what are the mechanisms to make sure that we do see lower income households with access to solar and batteries. Electric vehicles is obviously a source of battery power as well, so making sure there's access to that as well. Did you want to add anything, Justin?
I think community batteries is the other part of that picture as well. So and again, it's lots of things. It's not one thing, but part of it would perhaps be increasing rollout of community batteries so that solar power might be produced in an area and stored not on the premises but nearby locally. And again, products will need to be developed to enable consumers to utilise those assets, but they're being trialled and worked on by distributors and retailers at the moment as well.
Remind me, the capacity investment scheme, that actually provides a net revenue per megawatt hour floor to grid scale solar, doesn't it? That's the idea of it.
I think questions on capacity investment scheme should be directed to the department.
Right. Well, this is, for me, it's a three-tiered system. You're going to have rich households who can form batteries. You're going to have politically connected renewable energy companies who can navigate the ministerial approval of the capacity investment scheme that get a guaranteed price. They don't have to pay the sun tax. They get a guaranteed price. Then you're going to have the poor households copping it and paying for the rest of it, because the more we subsidise, well, you can answer this question presumably, given your other answers, the more we subsidise the grid scale solar to get this minimum price wherever it's done, the poorer households who can't afford the battery are going to be paying a higher sun tax, right?
I'm not sure I quite understand the connection.
Because you don't like the word sun tax, but you said earlier, the more grids, all other things being equal, the more supply we've got of solar, the bigger the issue is in the middle of the day.
But
they're going to get a lower price. They're going to have to potentially be charged for it because there's too much solar.
But I didn't understand the connection you made to the poor households without solar. That was
because they can't afford a battery. They can't
but
get
they
away
don't have
from
solar either, presumably.
Well, some of them already do because you've been getting it for free, basically, to date by some state governments. You get it for almost nothing. So a lot of households do, but they can't necessarily afford a battery, which is much more expensive.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood, because I thought when you were referring to poor households, you were referring to households without solar.
No. I'm saying there's three groups here, right? There's
a group of households who are poor who don't have solar.
The really rich households that can afford, I don't know, it's $10,000-$20,000, isn't it, for a battery? It's huge. They can afford that. There's the really rich investors who are making a hay from the ESC of this place, but they get subsidies from us, get a minimum price. They don't have to pay a tax in the middle of the day. And then you get the poor sobs who have saved up their pennies to get a solar system with subsidies. They've had to pay a little bit, but it's affordable. And they can't afford a battery, and now they're getting slugged. They get slugged more the more we provide subsidies to the renewable energy companies.
I think, Senator, you might have forgotten another important set of households who don't have solar or batteries.
I don't forget them.
We're trying to ensure that there is equity across the energy system, and so when there is the introduction of an export charge, part of that is making sure that those households who don't have solar or batteries are not paying for the network for those who do.
When does the sun tax come into effect?
I'm not sure what you're referring to when you call it a sun tax.
When does the 1.2 cent kilowatt charge come into effect?
So Dr Funston might want to add to this, but there are a range of different export charges and export rewards that are in the network tariffs across jurisdictions, but in New South Wales it would have commenced on the 1 July, is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. So in New South Wales, 1 July.
New South Wales 1 July next year.
It's already happened.
Oh, it's already happened. They already paid. All right, cool. I'll hand over. I've got more, but we'll see how we go.
Next then, if you don't mind. Thank you for appearing and for your...
So far, Senator.
Sorry?
I was joking.
I didn't hear you.
I said it's not very fun so far.
Well, let's see what we can do. I'm particularly interested in the NEM is probably one of the most vital drivers of economic productivity in the Australian economy. And I'm interested in if the current policies, market and system rules are set to optimise that economic benefit to the economy. And the effect of the transition to a net zero economy and its effect on the NEM, or as the NEM is planned for in the ISP, raise some questions in my mind as to the economics underlying the decisions on investments being made. In the ISP, it used to set a process, or the market rules, I think, is probably better articulated at. once a project was indicated as wanting to move forward, it started going down the process of RIT-T, a regulatory investment test for transmission. And that was a multi-part process to do that. Prior to the ISP and AEMO being given the powers to make projects actionable and therefore have to be constructed, AER had a role in part of that assessment process, didn't you?
That's correct.
Can you tell me a little bit about that?
So prior to the integrated system plan, large transmission projects would generally have been identified through either the transmission annual planning report that the transmission companies produce, or potentially through what AEMO and before that NEMCO used to call the National Transmission Network Development Plan.
Yep.
And when a business would come to the AER with its 5-year revenue determination, those projects might not have been at a place where they were ready to be approved, and so they'd be identified through that revenue determination as a potential contingent project application, so something that might happen before the next 5-year regulatory determination. And the AER would stipulate a number of triggers that would have to be met before a contingent project could come to the AER for assessment. Mm-hmm. And one of those triggers one of them was the successful completion of the RIT-T. Another one was often what we would call a 516(6) determination. So that referred to an old clause in the National Electricity Rules, which was 5.16.6. And in that 516(6) provision, the AER was able to make a determination basically on whether a preferred option was the option that essentially maximised the net economic benefit under the RIT-T. And so those two things used to be triggers that would sit within the contingent project applications, and so when one of them came to us, we would issue a 516(6) determination. So we'd look at the RIT-T and we would confirm whether or not the preferred option satisfied and maximised the net economic benefit. So, but with the introduction of the integrated system plan, my recollection is I think 516(6) was removed from the rules in about April 2020. Yeah.
So it sat as part of the RIT-T, because that has, I believe, 3 steps, a PADR, PACR, and then a feedback loop?
No, so this was before the ISP, so there was no feedback loop then. It was just, there used to be the project specification consultation report, then there was the project assessment draft report, right. Then there was the project assessment conclusions report. So they were the 3 steps of the RIT-T. Once that RIT-T had been done, and so one trigger was that had to happen, yep. And then a separate trigger was that the AER had to effectively issue, so the business would have to come and ask for a 516(6) determination, which we would make, and that would be how the projects could then proceed to contingent project application.
And that 516(6) was an economic assessment rather than just a cost assessment. Is that correct?
That's correct, Senator. So we would, at the time, we would make a determination about whether the preferred option that had been identified in the RIT-T was the option that would maximise the net economic benefits.
Net economic benefit for the country or for
the electricity system. Yes,
sorry?
For the electricity system.
For the electricity system. But it was an economic rather than just a cost one.
Yeah.
With the change... post-Finkel review, the ESB came in and then against Finkel review's recommendations said that AEMO had the power to make transmission projects actionable. And that power or that step or the word actionable effectively means it has to be built. Is that correct?
So it's interesting. I did listen to a little bit of the session this morning, not all of it, and I heard you ask AEMO about this, and I was trying to see if I could remember, because I was on the Energy Security Board at the time, and in fact I think Senator Canavan would have been in a lot of those meetings. You were Resources Minister then, I think.
Yeah, I wish I had more influence.
And so I think from memory, actually, the COAG Energy Council directed the ESB to make the integrated system plan actionable. And so I think there's a communique. I didn't have time to check, but
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure there was a communique from around that time. And so when the Energy Security Board was then tasked with coming up with a set of rules to make the integrated system plan actionable. That's what we were directed to do by ministers in their response to the Finkel review.
And that was, if you read the media around it, etc., that was to shorten the time of approvals. Some people expressed views that the 516(6) took a long time.
That's correct, yeah. And I became chair of the AER before those rules were actually agreed, so I sort of switched hats in the middle. But certainly there was a concern that the transmission approval process was taking a long time, that 3 stages were unnecessary, and particularly that first project specification consultation report, that some of that very early work could be done in the integrated system plan.
Mm-hmm.
And so that when the integrated system plan was complete, projects that where there were candidate options identified in the integrated system plan could move straight to that second stage of the RIT-T. And another element of it was to remove the AER's 516(6) assessment. And put the feedback loop in, I should say. Yeah.
And do you think system planning and the system that we're ending up with is more? Do you think there's a risk that it's becoming less economically efficient and productive with the removal of that 516(6)? Because now there isn't an economic assessment done of projects, is there?
Well, the economic assessment of the project that's done now is the integrated system plan and the feedback loop. So the feedback loop replaced effectively the 516(6). There is still the RIT-T, and the RIT-T is obviously a cost-benefit analysis. And so I think the view is that between having the integrated system plan, which is a cost-benefit analysis at the beginning, then the more detailed work on the regulated investment test for transmission, which has 2 stages to it, and then it going through the feedback loop again for a further economic assessment and testing, that a 516(6) in that context was redundant.
But none of those steps are now, post that rule change, are an economic assessment.
All of those steps are.
No, they're a cost-benefit analysis. There's a big difference between a cost-benefit analysis and an economic assessment.
Can you help? I just want to understand how you're making that distinction. So what are you saying is in an economic assessment that's not in a cost-benefit assessment?
Well, a cost-benefit analysis just says, do the costs outweigh this in a system? An economic analysis looks more broadly and says, are there other ways to achieve this need? Does this project meet the need in the most economic way?
So I should probably clarify then. I think when we were doing the 516(6) assessments, it was a cost-benefit assessment. It was looking at different ways of delivering the project and doing economic modelling to determine that, but it was still only looking at costs and benefits within the electricity system. Yeah.
So you wouldn't look at whether, just an example off the top of my head, a transmission project was more or less efficient than a non-network solution to the problem?
Oh no, that would be, but that would be included now too. So they are required under the rules to consider both network and non-network solutions. It's one of the reasons the RIT-T still exists, is because it's hard for the integrated system plan at that very macro level to identify non-network solutions. But the transmission companies, when they do the RIT-T, they are meant to look at both network and non-network solutions. Did you want to add to that? I can see you nodding, Steph.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really critical thing that the RIT-T contributes. The ISP has identified a need and a candidate project to meet that need, but in carrying out the RIT-T for that actionable project, the proponent needs to test the credible options for meeting the need. So that needs to include the option that's in the ISP, but they also need to look at all of the other credible options for meeting that need, which could include non-network solutions. It could include different ways of delivering a network solution, and that's what you see in RIT-Ts. So In the HumeLink RIT-T, for example, they had a range of network options in particular. They were the top 3. They involved different sort of capacity lines running from different locations, but fundamentally they were looking across all of those. What are the relative costs and benefits of them? They must then identify as their preferred option the one which has the greatest net benefit out of all of the ones that they identify.
Sure, but you said that they looked at line options or etc. I can't remember, and I've not read every PADR, but I can't remember seeing non-networked options assessed in the same way that transmission options would be.
In smaller ones you would. So when you see some of the smaller RIT-Ts, they might have, for example, battery solutions, or they might tender for opportunities. I mean, I can think of one in particular, Broken Hill is what I'm thinking about. So there's a Transgrid did a RIT-T for the system in Broken Hill, and actually the preferred option was a non-network solution. So it's compressed air storage from memory. But so there are examples of it. Probably you're less likely to see the non-network solutions get up in very big infrastructure projects. Were you looking to say something? No.
And that's interesting in of itself when you then look at a project such as VNI West. Now, as I put to AEMO earlier, large-scale transmission, let's call them interconnectors rather than just transmission to differentiate, in Australia, or particularly in the NEM, don't have much, if any, economic benefit going for them. Interconnectors are meant to either temporarily spread supply or load, geographically, where there's massive differences in solar or wind resource from one to the other. And there's a third one that escapes me right now, but I'll come back to that. So the economic benefit for large-scale transmission or interconnectors is pretty tenuous, particularly given the huge amount of cost, plus cost to environment, social licence, communities, all the other things. You look at a project such as VNI West, where the economic justification for it was that it would stop Victoria having to build pumped hydro somewhere in there because it could import energy from batteries in New South Wales.
And snowy hydro, yeah.
And that makes absolutely zero sense because there's no argument that Victoria could just as easily build batteries and have its own energy supply from those, as opposed to having to import it from New South Wales.
My understanding was, and Steph might want to add to it though, that it was less about storage from batteries and more about storage from the Snow 2.0 project.
Yeah. Yes.
I'll be interested to hear more on that. I'll notice if you care to.
So I think the identified need would go to that. Have we got the identified need for the VNI West project?
Let me pull that up for you.
We can keep going, but
sure.
Steph will have a look.
So now that you no longer do 516.6, you are responsible for assessing the contingent project application. Am I right in characterising that as basically just looking at the costs, seeing if they're reasonable and seeing if they add up?
Yes. I mean, the thing I would still say is there's still 4 triggers that need to be met for us to do a contingent project application decision. So the first one is still the successful completion of the RIT-T. The other ones are that there's no disputes on foot, that it's been the identified need is met by the preferred option confirmed by EMO through the feedback loop, and that the costs haven't escalated to a point where they wouldn't pass the economic assessment of the feedback loop. So those 4 hurdles still have to be met before we can go through a CPA. And, you know, if there's been a dispute raised on any of those elements of it, we would hear that dispute as well and may need to form a view in the event of a dispute. So you're right in the sense that the CPA assessment itself is just a cost assessment. Is this cost reasonable for building this project? But you would see, for example, you know, when HumeLink came to us, one of the things that they had to do was what was called, the onus is on a project proponent to form a view about whether or not there's been a material change in circumstances. And given there had been quite a large change in the cost of HumeLink from when it first was conceived and did its RIT-T to when the contingent project application came to us, we wrote to Transgrid in August 23 and said, hey, don't forget about this obligation. You may need to consider whether there's been a material change in circumstances. They did that analysis. They provided that to us with the completed RIT-T. We put that out for consultation as we consulted on the contingent project application and heard from quite a number of stakeholders that they didn't feel confident in that material change in circumstances analysis. And so we commissioned our own economic modelling to test the robustness of that material change in circumstances analysis. So we sort of have a role, but it tends to come in more as part of those triggers and in the event of a dispute rather than an enshrined role like we did before. Did you want to add to that, Justin, at all?
No, I think that's essentially right. I think the other point, just to be clear about the 5.16.6 review, is that it was essentially a review of the RIT-T process that had been undertaken. It wasn't a wider test, because I think, Senator, I may have heard you describe that as an economic test. But essentially it would be the TNSP undertakes the RIT-T, is our preferred option. If it were to come to us under 5.16.6, it would be to confirm that the preferred option under the RIT-T was in fact the preferred option under the RIT-T. So we're essentially reviewing that work that had been done. It wasn't a wider or different test.
And if there is a material blowout in cost, and that's confirmed, the proponent would have to go back and restart the RIT-T process, is that correct?
Not necessarily. So if there's been a material change in circumstances, now the requirement is they would have to tell us, produce a report, here's what happened, here's what we might do. One possibility of that review might be to say you need to go back and do it again, but there might be other ways to deal with it, to do further modelling to see whether, in fact, it would still be the preferred option. So costs and benefits can change without necessarily changing the ranking of options.
And under a rule that AEMC put through in October 2022 about a material change in network infrastructure project costs, that rule itself says that a proponent of projects with an estimated cost greater than $100 million to develop reopening triggers. So the proponent themselves develop their own reopening triggers?
So I might get Steph to respond to this, but that rule actually wasn't in place when we did the HumeLink letter. That's why we wrote to them in the first place, because we were trying to sort of strengthen the arm a little bit on that question. Right. And I think that rule change did recognise that there was probably insufficient guidance on what in a project proponent's view meant. We've given further guidance on that in our guideline, haven't we?
Yeah, we have. And it's really about being transparent around what those reopening triggers are, so that, all stakeholders have the opportunity to understand them, to comment on them, to, I guess, keep track of how the project is progressing relative to them, and that's done up front throughout the project, rather than having a conversation at the end about what makes something material or otherwise.
Given such a huge increase in project costs, are you able to provide the committee with whatever assessment you did that said that this was still a project that economically made sense to go forward?
Chris, did we publish our material change in circumstances analysis? I thought we did.
I thought we did,
Yeah, I think it's published, so yeah, we can provide that.
Okay, that would be great.
Essentially what we did, though, is we looked at, with the other two options that were on the table, so option 3C was the preferred option for HumeLink, but the other two options they, in our view, had perhaps not given them the benefit of the early works that we'd seen attribute to the option 3C. So we bolstered the benefits, or reduced the costs effectively of the other two options to recognise the benefits of early works. We then got ACIL Allen to do independent market modelling to look at the benefits, because Transgrid had effectively assessed the benefits of option 3C at something like 4 times what the ISP had it at. So we remodelled those benefits and came up with a number that was sort of reasonably consistent with where the ISP was at. But even once you took into consideration, lower costs for the other two options and lower benefits for the third option, it still was the option 3C was still the preferred option.
Thank you. AER is responsible for issuing guidelines on how benefits are assessed. Is that correct?
The cost-benefit assessment guidelines,
Yes.
yeah, that's correct.
In the ISP, and I assume this went to some of the benefits in the HumeLink application, there's a remarkable number of benefits that get counted as market benefits in the ISP and in this process. And perhaps you can enlighten me on why some of them exist, because for the life of me I can't understand why. I'm just going to Appendix 6 of the ISP. Give me 1 second.
Someone got Appendix 6 of the ISP.
As counted as market benefits being delivered by the ODP, and this is Figure 1, page 12.
We don't have it in front of us, Senator, so we're going to have to take it.
If you'd like, I can table it, but I think you'll be fairly familiar with it.
If you walk us through it, we should be okay.
I will do my best. In that AEMO count, and this is for the ISP, not for HumeLink in particular, but they count generator and storage capex savings as a market benefit. How is... I failed on it. One, I can't find it in your guidelines anywhere, so perhaps you could highlight for the committee where that exists as a class of market benefit in your guidelines. 2, it's nonsensical to me that when we're trying to reach a target of 82% renewables, we're trying to firm up those renewables with storage, etc. And the fact that transmission neither generates 1 electron, stores 1 electron, or lowers 1 gram of carbon. How is either deferring or cancelling out generator and storage projects a market benefit?
So I'll give you a high-level answer and I'll hand to Steph to fill in the gaps. But essentially the way in which the RIT is done and the ISP is done in a very similar way, and the cost-benefit analysis guidelines are used to guide both of them. We're looking at the costs and benefits that attribute to all those who produce, consume or transport electricity. So that's what the rules require us to do, and so it's almost a closed loop. And in that sense, when you're looking at effectively not spending money on generation or storage, it's avoided capex as well as avoided fuel savings. They are a class of market benefits because effectively we're not spending money on those, but we are obviously spending money on the cost of transmission. So generation and transmission are seen as substitutes in that test, and one can displace the other. But did you want to speak to that, Steph? And Steph has
sorry, before you do, Ms. Jolly, there is enormous differences in economic benefit of generation storage versus transmission. I think we can all agree on that. So how is that, for the good of the energy system and the Australian economy, how is that counted as a market benefit? It is in the closed loop of one particular project. I can understand that. But that's nonsensical in the broader economic sense.
So the way we describe it in our cost-benefit analysis guidelines, which I think is a useful way to think about it, is if you're trying to decide what's the optimal development path for the electricity system, you're looking to maximise the benefits. And so the types of benefits that we're looking for are, I guess, the change in between one option and another in economic terms, the consumer surplus. So that's the difference between what customers are willing to pay for electricity versus the actual price that they pay. And then on the producer side, the difference between the revenue received and the cost of providing those services. So that's where some of those factors like the cost to deliver a service through one form of generation or another, or one combination of generation and transmission and another, or a non-network solution, become really relevant. And under the rules, there's a big long list of the types of things that form classes of market benefits in that respect. And differences in capital costs between different forms of generation and different solutions is explicitly captured in that list, alongside a whole group of other things like fuel consumption, the timing of when something can be delivered.
I'll come to those ones. But given, certainly for energy consumers, output from generation is dealt with through the market. We all accept a market is a fair and economic way to deal with things. Storage has benefits in and of itself in spreading the amount of electricity available across time. It also potentially has the benefit of displacing baseload coal. It seems like all those are, and transmission has a cost to it, that's going on the back of every one of our energy bills. So explain to me how, in an economic sense, displacing generation and storage is a smart economic move.
I think one of the other things to think about too is the context, and we're going into a period of load growth, but we have obviously been through a period of load reduction, and following privatisation in the early 1990s, as you would well remember, we had a large overhang of
Not the early 1990s, I don't.
No, sorry, in the late 1990s, that there was a large overhang of generation. And so one of the things when you're thinking about that, the way a RIT-T's done, is if you've got lots of generation, for example, in New South Wales and less generation in Victoria, and you wanted to think about the most economically efficient way of delivering energy for those consumers, if there's excess supply in one region and insufficient supply in the other, rather than building more capacity in the other region and just having even more capacity, a transmission interconnector is a way in which it would potentially increase economic value. So that's that class of benefits. You're asking me to describe how and why it exists. That's how and why it exists. So, and when a RIT-T is done, there is market modelling done with it. So an ACL Allen or an EY Rome, I don't want to plug them all, but they all have very profitable consulting houses who go out there and do the market modelling of these things, and they test all of these scenarios. So, is it cheaper in aggregate to build just more transmission or to build more generation at centre and load centres? And that's the test that's going on. It's not just an assumption that, well, because there's no molecules or electrons that come from transmission, that there's no value to it. If you're more efficiently sharing resources, there is economic value coming from that. And if you displace the need to invest in new capital expenditure in local areas because you can make more efficient use of what's already there, that's a benefit, and that's why it's captured under the RIT-T.
I'd be interested to see on notice the actual justification of that, of where there is such excess capacity in one region of the NEM versus another that's going to justify that, because I can't say. I admit, yes, there was a historic reason for that.
So just for the purposes of on notice, so you would like us to unpack that 15.38 in generator and storage CapEx savings?
Yeah, or
that might be better put to AEMO because it's their report.
I can do that too, but perhaps it was was looked at in the HumeLink application. And my point, I think, is even further strengthened given that the ISP sets out very clearly how much more generation storage we're going to need. I mean, it is perfectly blunt on those points that it's an enormous amount that we're going to need. So again, using another piece of infrastructure to replace that and counting the benefit of that is nonsensical. And I want to hand over the call very soon, but perhaps you could take on notice also the market benefit of fuel cost savings. I assume that means as it displaces coal, those coal costs are saved. I mean, it's an enormous amount, $17 billion. Now, we all know that those fuel costs are going to disappear over time anyway, so I'm not sure how it's a long-term benefit, particularly not out to 2049-50. And the last one is how actionable and future ISP project costs are treated as a market benefit.
Yeah, I think we can unpack that in our question on notice, Senator, but I think the key thing is that it's relative to a base case in which that optimal development path doesn't occur. So it's that counterfactual that these figures are compared to that is creating that sense of
I didn't
benefit.
get an opportunity to ask AEMO, but I can't find their counterfactual model anywhere in the ISP. If it's in there, it's hidden in one of the workbooks. I did, and thank you for the Deputy Chair. That's exactly what I was trying to do. So if you could take those on notice,
Yeah.
and
if you're okay, we'll answer them as they relate to our functions.
Of course.
I think AEMO will need
yeah,
to explain.
I'll do the same ones to AEMO. Senator Pocock, you have the call.
Thank you for your time this afternoon.
Have you had your baby yet?
I'm not having one.
No.
No, I haven't. I'm not sure if I'd be here if we had, but I appreciate your time here this afternoon. And I wanted to start with a few questions about availability of data to guide the best locations for community batteries, EV chargers and other consumer energy resources. I understand UTS and Energy Networks Australia publish network opportunity maps, but from what I can tell, the DNSPs have by far the best data, particularly below a sort of zone substation level. And I'm interested if you agree that it would be beneficial for consumers and community organisations to have access to this sort of data that the DNSPs would have.
I think you're right, firstly, that they do have better data than is generally available. We have been doing a project that's been looking at network visibility, so I didn't know, I'm not sure who's best placed to speak to network visibility, probably Dr Funston.
Yeah, we are in the midst of doing that project, and yes, you're right, it is the networks that would have the best data. I think the challenge with the networks is the different networks at different levels of maturity. In particular, where there are smart meters, they've obviously got much better visibility than those networks which don't, which is also why there's a rule change at the moment looking at smart meter rollouts.
Why isn't this data being made public? It seems to me, in my interaction with community groups and others interested in the space, that it would be for all of our benefit to have more transparency, more data to make decisions. What's sort of stopping that from happening?
Look, I think you're right. I think it's the availability of that data in the first instance. So the network visibility report, I should add that the report that we were just referencing, we're at stage 2 and that report has been released. So that's available to people to have a look at to see what we've actually done in relation to that. In terms of just more generally, we are collecting information to look at what's happening around network exports as well, and there's now reporting that we do on export services as well. So we're looking at what level of consumer energy resource there is and how that's impacting the network, and reporting on the performance of networks as well around that.
But I don't think there's any reluctance on our part to see the publication of the data. I think we would agree with you. And so part of the network visibility project's been about getting that data maturity to the point where there's something that's reliable that can be released. So we're on the same journey and certainly working with networks to that end. Yeah.
So there's nothing stopping DNSPs
Publishing
more data?
The only thing I would be a little bit unsure of that I just want to check is just that there's no cybersecurity implication or something like that. So I don't want to say I'm confident on it, but can we come back to you on that question?
Sure.
Yeah.
And is there a timeline for this piece of work that you're talking about to have that out there so people can look at it and make decisions?
Yeah, so look, we've done stage 1, stage 2, and there's a stage 3, which is the finalisation, and we're hoping to complete that either towards the end of this year or early next year. But we can provide some more information around that.
Thank you.
Take that on notice.
And is the plan to have it sort of publicly available, or how will that be presented?
Look, what we're doing is really, I would sort of liken it to a trial project to see what is out there and what we can actually do. So it's a starting point to look at what we could potentially do in the future as well.
Okay.
When we've looked at things like the granting of waivers, for example, so where we've allowed businesses to invest in community batteries or some of the things that might normally be more a contestable space, we have put information publication obligations on them in that context as well to make sure that the data and the process they're going through to tender for these types of projects is available to everyone. But we definitely see, I mean, transparency is like our key feature, right? That's the thing we hold dear. So from our perspective, if there's an opportunity for greater transparency, it's something we'd be driving for as well.
Thank you. So I just want to be clear. So you're undertaking this work, which sounds great and much needed. If you do find a way to standardise it and have useful data, will you be forcing DNSPs to release that? Will you be responsible for releasing data as...
I mean, we collect information at the moment through our regulatory information notices, so we could look at how we might think about changing that in the future if there is an identified need for this data to be in the public domain, which I think there will be, so we can look at that going forward.
I don't know, would we collect it though at the level of detail that I think the Senator's referring to?
I think that's probably the challenge in terms of, and that again comes back to the level of maturity in terms of where the networks are at. Those with smart meters, like the Victorian networks, will have this data available. Other networks won't necessarily be at the same level of maturity to be able to provide that data.
Okay.
Yeah. If you wouldn't mind, I wouldn't mind us having a chance to just come back to you
Sure,
with a
that'd
bit
be
more
great.
information
That'd be really
about
useful.
the network visibility project and just what that roadmap looks like.
Thank you. If I can move on to some questions I have that came out of an article by Peter Haddam in The Guardian on the weekend, highlighting issues with